So there's two parts to the presentation today. The first, in my overview last month, I only spoke briefly about the connection to the air quality regulatory world from the blueprint, and told you that we were going to have Larry Greene, the air pollution control officer for the Sacramento district, come and give you a more in-depth briefing about the technical and policy issues of how our two worlds are so closely interwoven. And then secondly,
Yeah, this is going to be challenging.
Okay,
They've turned all the lights off.
There I know.
And then secondly, Kacey Lizon, who heads up our land use section and is our MTP project manager, is going to talk about, I talked about why the board launched the blueprint and what benefits this organization has seen from the implementation of the blueprint. Kacey's presentation is going to be on what activities you have authorized and directed staff to conduct to help our members implement the blueprint. And that will be a much shorter presentation than mine was. But first, Larry is going to take us into the air quality world. They're all yours.
We've tried to make this as straightforward as possible, but this is quite a complex subject. And then when you layer the air district's work with the transportation work, which obviously we work very closely together, and that's what this presentation will certainly demonstrate, it gets pretty complex. So if you have any questions, please ask those as I go through this. There we go. We'll get back to the right spot here.
Teach you to change your slide order at the last second. Well, it just needs to be flipped around here. There we go.
You didn't need to wait on me,
Okay, now we're ready here. This is largely about the Federal Clean Air Act because most of our work, the work that really is carries sanctions and is very important for money. Federal funding comes through the federal government through the Federal Clean Air Act and the transportation side. So most of this is about the federal work that we do, but there is also a state Clean Air Act, and we do have a lot of work that we do in regards to the state. You can see the Federal Clean Air Act here started in 1963 as a research program, and a lot of the things that happened in the Federal Clean Air Act actually were based on what had happened in California, as California was dealing with air pollution before the rest of the nation was. And if you look down the 1990 Clean Air Act, for example, was based a lot on the 1988 California Clean Air Act, which was passed a couple of years before that. I did want to note here that in April 2007, the Supreme Court made a decision in a case and directed EPA to consider regulating greenhouse gases as an air pollutant. They have done that. They have determined that greenhouse gases are air pollutants. There's been legal action back and forth. But regardless of that, we have had two things that impact us. One is the federal government has a new set of standards for vehicles, for on-road vehicles that came about a few years ago, and that's underway, and that will dramatically improve the mileage of vehicles out in the 20s and 30s for the nation. And we, as an air district, are required to regulate greenhouse gases for our largest sources. Basically, the kind of things that we would regulate there are the same kind of things I would do for criteria pollutants, so there hasn't really been any real impact of that's come down. This is largely about what we call NAAQS, air quality standards. EPA reviews public health studies and passes those. They have to review those every 5 years. They typically miss that 5 years. They get sued by environmental groups, and they have to go back and court directs them to do that. So that's sort of a cycle they go through on a regular basis. But the result of that is, and you'll see later in the presentation, that we can have multiple, for example, we have multiple ozone standards that we're working on at the same time. They designate states or parts of states as what's called non-attainment areas, places that don't meet the standards. And then states have to do implementation plans to show how they're going to meet that standard. In California, for the larger districts, the state delegates that authority to air districts, and we in the Sacramento region work with our other fellow districts in the region to develop our plan. This process takes several years every time we have to do this, and it's similar in some ways to what the transportation plan does, a regular kind of a process, but it is, and as much as possible, we try to coordinate those two together. There's different requirements for SACOG and air quality districts with regard to this. For SACOG, the major impact is they get a conformity budget, which says they have a certain amount of headboard. They have to stay within a certain realm for their pollutants, PM10, PM2.5, ozone, and so on. So every time they do a plan or they do a project, they have to evaluate that against that budget that they get. And you'll see a little bit later how that comes about. For us, on the air side, we have to do a plan. So a new NACs that come out impacts both sides of us, transportation and air quality. We both have other planning requirements where we work together. We are interested in the CEQA review that SACOG does on their federal plans. They do an EIR that we look at, and we collaborate on looking at that, because sometimes, we help them with the air piece there, and we go back and forth there. They help us on our transportation things. And SB 375 planning requirements, we're very interested in that, and we do look at that as that process goes forward. We have on the air side some pretty significant responsibilities related to land use and planning in that way. We have some specific county and city ordinances that call us out to do, to review and endorse what's called air quality plans for larger projects. We also make comments under CEQA for greenhouse gases and air quality on all projects over a certain size. We generally just hit the biggest projects, but we look at many more projects, and it's quite common now for the projects to come in and do it very early in the development and work with us, so that the goal is, in almost every case this happens, we have a plan that we can go to the planning commission in your city or the county and say we endorse this project and we support it. That's very common to do, and we have a very good working relationship with the people that do that for a living. We also develop CEQA thresholds for air pollutants. This is important because what this does is, once we've developed a threshold, the counties and city can rely on that. And it saves them planning. It also saves project planning. They know they have a certain number that they're looking at there. We do air quality modeling. The air districts in California have developed what we call Cal ED-MOD. You don't have to know what that is, but that's a statewide program that they use, that consultants in cities and counties use to come up with the air quality impacts of projects. And that information, that's a free product we put together. We've done free training and so on, and that's provided for their benefit. Our board has approved a health risk assessment guidance and near roadway land use guidance for the benefit of the cities and counties. We developed that with the cities and county planning staffs. We also do training and outreach for your staffs in the cities and counties and in Sacramento County. We have a way for people who need construction mitigation, free board to come in and provide funding, and we'll help them get that mitigation covered. And while the EPA regulates greenhouse gases through standards, as I said earlier, they do delegate larger source permitting to us. This is a long-term story here on ozone. We have two pollutants that would be considered now to be non-attainment for. One would be ozone and one would be PM2.5. Ozone, we're going to be non-attainment for ozone, and especially with the new standard that's out into the mid to late 20s. It's going to be a long time. You can see we're making progress, One of the key things for you to note here is if you look, 70% of this is transportation related, and on-road transportation is a major portion here. So what happens at SACOG, what happens with the transportation plans is very important to that. And you'll see in a minute, I'll refer you back in your minds to a slide Mike used in the blueprint presentation. He had a slide which showed the trend for vehicle miles traveled per capita in the 2025 MTP and in the 2035 MTP. One was going up and one was going down. Because that second one was going down, when we did our 2008 ZIP, we got significant benefits from the transportation side. Because of that, you'll see later, we got significant benefits. And I think maybe for the first time in the nation, EPA agreed with that. And Mike and I actually briefed the director of EPA, Jeff Homestead, years ago on one of the cap-to-cap trips. He was pretty surprised to have an air person and a transportation person briefing him. And he was pretty surprised to see a good story coming out of something, of a collaboration like that. So what happens in the transportation plan is very important. And the reason that's important is that the emission reductions that happen, gotta go back. The emission reductions that happen here mean our business community doesn't have to get those reductions. So savings here go directly to the benefit of our business community and reduce the regulatory burden on our businesses. Let's see. The non-attainment here area for ozone includes Yolo, Sacramento, Placer, and El Dorado, except for the area up around Lake Tahoe, a bit of Sutter, and a bit of Solano County. So that's a pretty big footprint here. The other pollutant, PM2.5, that we're non-attainment for is a good story. You see here, this is wood smoke. And we realized many years ago when they passed the standard that that was going to be our biggest problem. There's only a little bit of transportation here. But wood smoke was unregulated, and my board, after 28 public meetings and 4 meetings with my board, passed a rule that said on days where we project we will exceed that standard, we can require people not to burn their wood in their fireplaces in Sacramento County. We have done that. It was controversial before. Afterwards, we've gotten very few calls because if you look at these lines, you can see the dramatic improvement there. Because of that, we've had clean years the way the EPA tested it, the monitor, in 2010, 11, and 11, 12, and 13, and we intend to put in for the non-attainment region a maintenance plan this summer. We'll take it to our board. What that will mean is that instead of doing a SIP, an air plan for PM 2.5, which we have new requirements on business and the farming community, we'll be showing we can maintain where we are without any new rules and regulations. And that is a huge story, and every time I brief this at EPA and DC, they just can't hardly believe we've been able to do something. That is a dramatic decrease in pollution right there. And that's from simply not burning our wood stoves on certain days in the wintertime. Now, however, we just barely meet the standard. So this means we need to stay the course, and on the transportation side, the conformity budget for PM 2.5, Mike tells me, is very tight. So this doesn't mean we're free. We're continuing to work. But the things we do, for example, getting cleaner trucks and cars and so on in the area, are also helping this particular thing. Standards tighten over time. You can see here there was a 79 standard, a 97 standard, a 2008 standard. Every time EPA goes back and looks at health studies, you see that a lower level of ozone impacts people's health. So what we've done in the area here, you can see, we attained the 1 hour standard here, that standard in 2008, I think that's 2008, yeah, 2009. And then we have the 1997 standard. We're going to attain that in 2018. We're on track to do that. We will be developing against the 2008 standard. Starting next year, we'll start developing a new plan that has to be done by 2015. So what this means is, and I'll show you in a minute, as we have tighter and tighter plans, we have increasing requirements on businesses and federal projects and so on. The kind of things we can do for cleaning up our vehicles, for cleaning up, on the SACOG side, help that process. This shows our inventory. NOx, nitrous oxides, and VOC together with sunlight creates ozone. You put that together.
Ooh. Ooh, do that again.
That was cool.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know how I did that.
Your PowerPoint.
But I wanted to show, this started in 2002 when we were doing the current SIP. That's where our inventory was. We do, we get transportation input from SACOG, it goes to ARB, we look at our inventory. This is where we had to go in 2018 to meet the standard. And that's a lot of rules and regulations. Also, there's, on the vehicle side, there's three things we can do. We can get cleaner vehicles, which is, hopefully a lot of zero emission vehicles like electric and so on, hybrids and such. We can get cleaner fuels, which fuels that emit less pollutants, or we can reduce VMT. And more over the years, we've found that that is a feasible thing to do. And when we had that change between the 2025 and the 2035 MTPs, that showed up right here. We got 2 tons of emission reductions against that 2018 SIP, and those were reductions, our business, that didn't have to come out of that little tiny red area there, which is our stationary sources, and everything else, the red and the blue are stationary and area. Everything else is transportation. So you can see most of our emissions are transportation. So we as an area, as opposed to some other parts of the country, have to get emission reductions out of that area. So you see here the 2 orange, this is the piece, VOCs and NOx. Those are the conformity responsibilities that SACOG has. At the end of the day, when we get to 2018, when we showed that, those are the budgets that they have to stay under. And they can't go over that top line, so they check all the projects and everything, making sure that we stay under that. Now there's sanctions on the air side for not doing the plan and not meeting your plan. Those could be increased mitigation requirements. We could regulate smaller sized businesses. We can have funding held back. At the worst case, EPA can come in and assume local powers and impose a federal plan on, it's called the FIP, Federal Implementation Plan. And there's penalties on large businesses, and I'll talk about that a bit later, I think. For transportation, failure to do to demonstrate conformity, you can have a lockdown, a lapse, and these kind of restrictions mean that only certain kind of projects can move forward, and they very much restrict what SACOG can do and what the plan can do over a period of time while you're still in a lockdown or a lapse. And this has really happened here. It happened back in 2003 and 4, and finally in 2006, through a lot of work between SACOG and the Air District and Region 9 and the Federal Highways, we got back on track and had an approved conformity budget. But that can happen. It delayed a lot of projects. 27 regional projects were impacted. On the air side, we can have significant fees. Now, because we didn't meet in 2005, we didn't meet the federal plan for ozone, we were required to collect $8 million from businesses in the region, the largest businesses. However, because the EPA had rescinded that plan, and because we argued at that time that because the 1-hour plan had been rescinded, we shouldn't have to collect these. EPA agreed with us, and we haven't got the final document that stamps approval on that, but so far we haven't collected that money, and we don't intend to. We intend to have a solution at the federal level so we don't have to do that. That was a nuance of the processes that were happening then, and there are significant penalties that can accrue here. So the two sides help each other. We get the future emissions are estimated from the transportation side that goes over and affects our inventory and helps set the conformity budgets. And we have in the Blueprint MTP significant benefits. We also work together on conformity, so we have some freeboard on the SACOG side for changes as time goes on in building and what happens with with population and the economy, we need freeboard on the air side, so projects like Folsom Dam can move forward without doing very significant costly mitigation. So but it helps both of our sides, and we work closely together on that, conformity on each side. On the transportation side, they do transportation control measures to help with air quality. Our CCAT, our program for incentives, where we're helped with some Clean Air Act money or some transportation money to reduce, to help people buy cleaner engines, comes from the SACOG side. And then we have regulations, incentive programs, and voluntary programs, all three together on the air side to reduce emissions. And that's my presentation.
Thank you.
I am picking up from Mike's presentation last month on the blueprint, and I'm going to start by referencing for you a couple of handouts that you have. One is the PowerPoint, which actually has some very detailed notes on some of the pages, which I encourage you to take a look at at your leisure. It's got a lot of information that I will not actually cover in my presentation. And then an example, which I will reference later in the presentation, of some of our technical review letters on development projects. So when the SACOG board adopted the blueprint in December of 2004, in addition to the blueprint principles and the conceptual map, the board also adopted a set of implementation actions. Those implementation actions were translated into tasks, which have been in the agency's overall work program for the last 9 years. So just kind of evolving over time, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about what I mean by that. But what I want to outline today are the 4 basic categories of implementation tasks, and they're sort of up there in these color blocks to signify proportionally how much time gets spent on them. So the first of those, and probably the most important, because it's associated with SACOG's core function, is aligning transportation funds to synergize with blueprint principles. Just hitting the highlights here, get into each of these a little more later. The second one is a major emphasis on assisting members in incorporating the blueprint principles into plans, policies, and codes. There's a lot of time that goes into this. It's by design. It's sort of trying to help with incorporating blueprint principles way upstream in an entitlement process, way before it gets to, say, an actual development application. The third category of tasks is really where we probably spend the least amount of time, and that's on individual development applications. And then the fourth category is this continuous effort to encourage federal and state actions to be supportive of blueprint implementation in the region. So, going over the highlights of the last 9 years. In 9 minutes.
And 1 minute per year.
Okay, so this first category, aligning transportation funds with the blueprint principles. So SACOG has certain regional funds that it can give out throughout the region. This is the regional funding program, which has been to your board last month, right? So the regional, local, bike and pedestrian and community design programs. Over the last 9 years, the funding round comes up every couple years, and there's always the board always comes back to look at the performance goals and the policies around how to distribute those funds to best align with blueprint implementation. The community design program in particular is designed to incentivize blueprint supportive development. And a very recent conversation that's happened at the Transportation Committee has been around one of the other programs, which is bicycle and pedestrian, specifically the master plan sort of directs the priorities for investing that funding program. So this is a very live item. It comes to your board very often. The second category, which I said we spend the next greatest amount of time on, is in this assistance to members in incorporating blueprint principles into, I have examples of general plans and codes and sphere of influence applications and policies. And what I want to emphasize here is that probably the majority of the tools that we've developed over the last 9 years have really come out of a request from jurisdiction staff and or SACOG board members. This has evolved over time. If you remember from Mike's presentation last month, he said that for the Blueprint Project, we convened, created a new committee called creatively the Planners Committee, which had the planning directors from each of the cities and counties in the region to provide technical advice on the Blueprint Project. It really was a way on a day-to-day basis to be able to bring the local land use priorities and local visions into that blueprint process. They were very helpful. They've actually continued to meet since then with a focus on implementation. And so that is the sort of working committee that we bring implementation evolution to. And so they have, in the very beginning of implementation, started out saying, look, you've got this regional plan, we're supposed to go and implement this, update general plans and codes and whatnot. We need specific tools to help. And so the emphasis early on, at their begging and pleading in some cases, was for visualization tools. And so we created lots of visualization tools for public workshops and public engagement. Fast forward to today, and many other, refocusing of implementation, and something that's recently come up is in this current housing element update cycle, a lot of need for housing data to use in the housing element update. So SACOG did a lot of data collection and analysis, provided that to cities and counties, and we've gotten good feedback that's been helpful to them. So really, this is all kind of, it's always trying to focus on what tools, what assistance we can provide. And this is an illustration of one of the tools that we had, because there's a lot of strange words in here without images for you, but an example of a photo visualization. There are 8 others like this for different parts throughout the region, and it's been used in some cases in local planning efforts, general plan, corridor visioning, and so forth. So the other thing I want to cover with this task is that, as I said, the Planners Committee evolved to focus on blueprint implementation. A lot of that charge has been with the land use forecast for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. So that committee meets every month to every 3 months, depending on the level of effort in our work program related to land use and housing topics. So an example I want to give you of how we interact with that group, both in the in your home jurisdiction as well as at the Planners Committee, is with the current MTP, the one that was adopted in 2012. 2.5 years ago, when we started that update, your staff here went to each planning department in the region to kick off basically the development of that forecast. We introduced them to the MTP, always again, because 4 years is a long time. Lots of things happen at the local level, at the regional level. We had a new statute we were implementing, and so walking them through what that process would be, what we hope to get out of working with your staff, what sorts of information we would need from them to do our job, and what information they would need from us to be able to participate actively in the process. From that point on, as we were developing the land use forecast, we've had 5 rounds of review to send this data to planning departments, and with time for them to do as they needed to. So in each jurisdiction, the situation is different. In some cases, maybe that review happened at the planning department, maybe it went to a board or a council for some sort of action or direction. And so we allowed for that time to be built in with those review periods. For your information, the public participation plan that's out for draft, the draft that's out for review right now, actually calls out explicitly that there will be time built in to allow for that. It was always there, but we're just making sure that that's pointed out. The third category of implementation, as I said, is really where we spend the least amount of time on the staff side. I've provided, the second handout is 2 letters that demonstrate sort of the technical analysis that we do. You've heard a lot about SACOG's supporting or opposing projects, and if you get a chance to take a look at these letters and read them, you'll see that they're carefully written so that they're providing technical information. There's some qualitative and some quantitative information, really depending on the size and nature of the project, but ultimately it's not a support or oppose type of letter. And it would be different than, say, if you go to a public hearing to see that somebody's submitted a public comment card where they might say that they support or oppose. This is not that type of an animal. It's going to be a very different type of thing. I do want to point out, so we've done 33 actual letters, briefings, or testimonies since the blueprint was adopted. Out of those, only 3 had technical information in them that raised significant concern. So most of the time it was taken, appreciated, and talked. So this is the 4th and last category I'd like to touch on, which is encouraging the federal and state actions to support blueprint implementation. The example that I will use here is related to SACOG's involvement in Senate Bill 375. SACOG and CSAC and the League of Cities supported this because it limited and focused the broad powers that were implicitly delegated to the California Air Resources Board by AB 32. So this allowed for basically for the region to continue its voluntary implementation of the blueprint. And so that's one reason that the SACOG was on board with that. The other work that has happened under this banner of tasks is a lot of work that Stacey McKinley has done working directly with federal agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, where there are issues with those regulatory agencies, how can the region meet those, or any particular project or jurisdiction meet the federal requirements while still being able to implement the blueprint and not thwart that progress. So that has been a pretty successful effort so far. Now, I would like to briefly to go over some of the research that we did on other development review programs in the state, and I have one example from outside of the state. So our sister agencies in the Bay Area in Southern California and San Diego have different aspects of a development review program. In the Bay Area, MTC is specifically focused on land use criteria around new major transit stops and funding those. In the San Diego and LA regions, these programs are broader. They're intergovernmental review programs. And it's shaped by the CEQA guidelines. And I've got a summary of the two sections from CEQA that are particularly used as a basis for their comments. And so you may hear the term projects of regional significance. This is often used in air quality, and it's actually also in the CEQA guidelines. For your information as well, the LAFCO statute was recently amended to require LAFCOs to consider regional plans when they are considering applications for spheres of influences and annexation. So I just wanted to put a summary of that section here. Okay, and then lastly, we looked outside of the region for other types of development review programs. The Atlanta Regional Council has one. It's a review of developments of regional impact. This is actually a state requirement. So there's a state law for all of Georgia. NPOs have to do this. And ARC's review is advisory for development projects on many issues. They have to coordinate that review with a state entity called the Georgia Regional Transportation Authority, which focuses its review on transportation-specific impacts of a project. GERDA's review is regulatory, so if they come up with a negative finding and there's no resolution to that, they can withhold state or federal funding. We've heard in talking with the staff that's not very, that doesn't occur very often, but there is a coordinated review between the region and that state entity. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.